Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 National Biodiversity Teach-In. I'm Mary Naganaki.
And I'm Katie Mitchell, and our next presenter is Elizabeth Bach.
Go ahead and take it away, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. Uh, so hold on, I think all right. Hopefully you're all seeing the landing page and not my notes right now. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back with the National Biodiversity Teach-In. I am Elizabeth Bach. I am a research scientist with an organization called the Nature Conservancy based here in Illinois, just down the road from our hosts in Elgin. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my job and day to day as we get deeper into the presentation. My expertise is in soil biodiversity, thinking about the biodiversity that lives beneath the ground. So I'd like to start out by encouraging you all to think a little bit about the word dirt and what comes to mind. And if you're in a classroom, feel free to share out loud with your friends and peers about what might be coming to mind. I'll give everybody a moment to kind of reflect and think about what does the word dirt mean to us usually. All right. So sometimes the word dirt usually ends up leading to dirty, and we're thinking about something that we might want to clean or dust that we need to sweep out of a house or a vehicle or a sidewalk or something of that nature. We're usually thinking of it's not usually wanted. It's usually not particularly wanted. So now I'm going to ask about the word soil. And again, if you're in a classroom or with some other folks, feel free to discuss out loud what comes to mind when you think of the word soil. Um, and I'll give us all a few moments to reflect on that and then keep us moving forward. All right. So the word soil sometimes brings some different things to mind. I, for one, am more likely to think about what I garden, where I garden, things that I'm planting plants into that grow plants, that support plants. I also certainly think about soil as a big ecosystem in and of itself. And what I really wanted us to kind of gain by taking some time to think about these two words is the difference between them. We often think of them as interchangeable, and they're often listed as synonyms if you go to a thesaurus, but there is a subtle difference between the word dirt and the word soil. And that key difference is actually life. Soil supports living things. Soil is alive itself. It's home to a lot of living things, which we're going to talk about today, versus dirt is more of a term referred to the non-living kind of dust and debris components. I often say dirt is what's in your house that you need to clean up. Soil is what's supporting your garden or your ecosystem or your plants outside. So the subtle difference is that soil is truly alive. Soil is actually home to now estimated over 50% of all organisms living on Earth. It means like half of the life on Earth is underground where we don't normally see it. Um, Throughout this presentation, if you have specific questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will pause and answer questions a few times throughout the presentation. But I'm also going to have some moments like this where I ask you to think in your group or out loud and where you are, so that we're all kind of thinking and engaging with this material. So I'm showing a bunch of photos in the slide. But when you think of what lives in soil, take a few moments and think about what comes to mind. And I'll give us all a minute to think about that. All right. So folks are probably thinking about earthworms. That usually comes to mind pretty quickly. Um, Maybe ants or termites that you see running around in the soil. Beetles. There's a lot of burrowing beetles that live in the soil. We also get fungi, the mushrooms that pop up in the spring and in the fall. We also see some bigger organisms like mice or moles or voles that live underground. And in fact, for those of you joining us from the United States, today is Groundhog Day. Groundhogs spend a large part of their life underground, particularly in the winter when they're taking a break and hibernating. So all of this diversity in soil is really cool in and of itself and really exciting to explore and respect, but it also does a whole lot for us as people. So first and foremost, soil biodiversity really supports humanity. It helps grow crops that we eat, the fruits and vegetables, grazers that become meat like beef or chicken or pork. All of these rely on things growing from the soil. We also see soil as a great repository, both for potentially disease organisms that can impact wildlife and humans, but also antibiotics and cures for some of those diseases. Thinking about the soil microbe that led to penicillin, penicillium. It's a fungus. It commonly grows in soil. In fact, the kind of industrial process for developing penicillin was developed in Illinois, in Peoria, for those of you joining from this state. And so, yeah, a lot of these organisms are literally in our backyards and can save lives as well as keep us healthy. Soil biodiversity also supports a lot of life that isn't human above ground. So we think about the trees and the plants and the grasses that I see in my work here in Illinois. All of those rely on soil organisms and their activities to have the nutrients to grow, the energy to grow, and to support animals above ground. I was just last week reading about the cicadas that are going to emerge this summer in the Midwest here near where I live. And those cicadas have spent 13 to 17 years underground eating the roots of plants and other soil debris before they emerge this summer. And so this soil has a really important role in supporting life above ground. Soil biodiversity also filters water. It helps us gain clean drinking water. It keeps aquatic habitats healthy for fish and frogs and turtles and other great organisms. The organisms in the soil, like earthworms, can create tunnels that allow water to flow through that soil, percolate down into groundwater, or spread out laterally to streams and creeks and lakes. A lot of microorganisms and fungi will use nutrients that water might be carrying through the system, reducing that nutrient load, neutralizing some of those components that water may have picked up from rainwater or in the soil it's filtering through. And this leads to clean drinking water that we can benefit from. And lastly, soil biodiversity helps regulate climate. Changing climate is even more pressing today than it has been in years. And soil plays a really big role. Climate change is really driven by this balance of what we call greenhouse gases, things like carbon dioxide or methane in the atmosphere. And soils play a really important role in how the atmosphere and the earth, the terrestrial system, balance these greenhouse gases. And so a lot of research that I and a lot of my colleagues do are really focused around thinking about how we can support soil organisms to regulate our climate and keep our earth in a really happy, healthy zone for people and for all the other living organisms around us. So the real thing that, I don't know, one of the key take homes I want you to have from today's talk is that soil biodiversity provides solutions to some of these environmental challenges that we're all facing today. Things like conservation farming practices can help reduce nutrients in waterways where they can kill aquatic organisms and retain more of those nutrients in the crops that farmers are growing to feed us all. Thinking about urban systems and cities and how green space is integrated and how soil organisms can address pollution that happens in cities and urban areas, and also support things like trees that can help cool down cities and make them more habitable as temperatures rise. And then specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about my work, which is much more focused on protecting natural areas and ecosystem restoration. So this is going to be one of my pauses for questions and answers. It looks like there's at least one question in the Q&A. If you're thinking of others, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A. Let's take a moment and I'll have our host jump back on and we'll answer a few questions.
So right now we have one question, and it is, how deep in the soil does life exist?
Awesome, really good question. And the answer depends a little bit on where you are, where you live, where the soil is. So there's some places like where I live here in the state of Illinois in the US, we have pretty deep soil in most of the state of Illinois. And we might see soil that's a meter or meter and a half deep. That's, you know, 4 to 6 feet deep, usually, sometimes even deeper than that. And we do know that there is some soil life, usually bacteria and fungi, that can live a meter or more deep in the soil. So 3, 4, 5 feet down in the soil. Most of the soil life lives in that top 5 to 10 centimeters, so 2 to 3 inches. That's where the majority of soil organisms live. That's where you see a lot of that microbial activity. And when you're talking about these larger mammals, like a badger, they might dig a hole that's 18 inches to 2 feet or a little deeper underground. So that's kind of the range that you're going to see. There's other systems that have very shallow soils. They hit bedrock after only an inch or two. And in those systems, all your life is confined to those inch or two. So it really just depends on the soil and your system.
Alrighty, we have another question here. It says, how has agriculture in Illinois changed the composition of soil?
Oh, really good question. And this sets me up great. I'm gonna actually talk about how soil biodiversity changes with restoration, but I didn't really set up how agriculture changes it. So I'm happy to talk about this right now. When Europeans came into the area that's now called Illinois, they recognized that the soil in Illinois could grow these grain crops that they were used to really, really well. And so a lot of the state was converted from a prairie or a grassland ecosystem into a pretty highly managed row crop agricultural system. And that system relies or has typically relied on a lot of tilling and planting to kind of create the best conditions for growing those grain crops. And what that does is it does impact the soil biodiversity. We know that active agricultural fields in Illinois have about a third of the soil biodiversity that a native prairie habitat would have. And like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that trajectory on the restoration side of things, but it does have an impact. There certainly still is a lot of life in agricultural soils, and agricultural soils rely on that biodiversity, but it is a lot less than what we see in a native ecosystem.
Okay, so our next question comes from Shari, and it is, does modern time tilling affect soil biodiversity and life in the shallow part of soil?
Yeah, absolutely. So a system that's regularly tilled is going to have a different kind of soil community in it. You're going to have a lot of organisms that don't mind that kind of physical disturbance. There are certain organisms that really thrive on that. They have kind of a lifestyle where when the soil gets turned over, they rapidly colonize the area. They use all of that oxygen to break down a lot of organic matter. They're pretty happy in that situation. So they're going to really do well in a system that's tilled every year. Other organisms don't do well in that system. They like to stay protected in what these little soil clumps. In the science world, we call these aggregates, but they're just clumps of soil. They kind of have a lifestyle that's based on breaking down dead plant and animal materials, and an agricultural system that's tilled a lot tends to not have a lot of that in the system. And so it's just going to shift your community. So like I said, it tends to be a little smaller, and you see different kinds of organisms that are have adjusted to that kind of lifestyle.
Alrighty, and our last question is from YouTube. I keep hearing about jumping worms. What are they, and should we be concerned?
Oh, really good question. Awesome. So jumping worms are an example of a soil organism that has been introduced into parts of the United States. They are native and an important part of the system in many parts of Asia. And when in those systems where they have evolved with peers and other soil organisms, they're great. They are really efficient at eating dead leaves and dead plant material and converting that. They're called jumping worms because they kind of have a lot of energy, and you can sometimes actually see them leaping out of the soil, jumping, so to speak, as much as a worm can. And so in the places where these jumping worms have existed for centuries and millennia, they're great. They're a really important part of that system. Where they've been introduced in parts of North America and other parts of the world where they haven't existed before, they are consuming a lot of dead plant material on the surface and really changing the decomposition cycle in these systems. So the places that we're seeing them show up tend to actually be through mulch. It seems to be they're being transported through mulch being moved around. They've been showing up in kind of arboretums and areas with high levels of landscaping. And where they've been a concern is that they consume and break down that mulch really quickly. They consume and break down a lot of material really quickly, and it can really transform those specific habitats where they haven't been before. So yes, they are a concern in some places where they haven't where they haven't kind of evolved with the system, primarily because they're eating everything they possibly can, and that can negatively impact plants that should be thriving in those areas. Well, really good questions. I'm going to start moving on to the next part of the presentation, but please keep adding your questions to the Q&A. We'll stop and take a break and answer more questions through this next section. All right, so I am an ecosystem restoration scientist. That's a big clunky title, but I work for an organization called the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit organization. We're also called a non-governmental organization. It's actually a global organization, and we are dedicated to protecting nature and biodiversity around the world. The organization is built up so that there's kind of a local presence in many countries and across all 50 states in the United States. So I work for the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. I'm specifically based in Illinois, and I'm based at a preserve called the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve, which is in northwestern Illinois. I work in the tallgrass prairie and savanna habitat. This area covered what is now the state of Illinois and the Midwestern part of the US historically. You can see kind of the green outline on this slide here. That was the historic extent of this ecosystem. And it's actually one of the most imperiled ecosystems in the entire world. Here is a map from the Illinois Natural History Survey showing kind of an estimate of what land cover in Illinois probably looked like in 1850 and what it looks like today. And what you can see is a really strong conversion from this light green grassland and darker green forest along the rivers in southern Illinois into a landscape that's really dominated by this yellow agriculture with some key urban areas. And so as our previous questions already hinted at, this has really changed the soil environment as well as the environment above ground. So as I mentioned, I am based at a preserve where our goal is to protect some native prairie where it exists, but also rebuild some native prairie, to actually take some agricultural fields and replant them into prairie and create some space for these native plants, animals, and soil organisms to continue to thrive here in Illinois into the future. So you can see the push pin here. This is where I'm located, where I'm joining you from this morning. Our hosts in Elgin are located, I think, kind of right over here by the S, if that kind of helps folks get some context for where we are. So the Nachusa Grasslands Preserve began in the mid-1980s with the purchase from willing landowners of about 400 acres that included a big chunk of native tallgrass prairie that had been grazed but had never been plowed up. And in fact, the photo behind me is that original 400-acre purchase. This part of Illinois is a little bit unusual. We have a very sandy soil and it's pretty shallow on these hills. And so it couldn't be plowed. It just wasn't a great habitat for agriculture. So that's part of why these native prairies existed. And the vision was to purchase some of the agricultural land around these and restore it to tallgrass prairie, plant the same native plants that were on these hills and kind of re-knit together in this one place a bit of that native habitat that once covered all of Illinois. Today, the project is 1,600 hectares. That's 4,000 acres. Some people think in hectares, some people think in acres. Most of that has been restored, picked, and planted, including this photo that you see here. It's home to over 700 native plant species, 250 bird species use the habitat. We are home to over 270 bee species. And yes, that is a lot of bee species. It is a biodiversity hotspot for bees particularly. And more recently, the Nature Conservancy has been able to reintroduce bison grazing to this habitat. And I'm happy to talk more about that bison grazing interaction in the Q&A and a little bit later in the presentation. I also want to emphasize that this restoration project is an and with our agricultural neighbors. I grew up in a farming family. It's very much an important part of what happens in our landscape. And there's opportunities for both agriculture and nature to thrive in Illinois. And that's what we're trying to do here in Nachusa Grasslands. So to bring us back to our soil topic, where I started, I know I'm a scientist, so I brought a few graphs. I can't help myself. It's what I do. This is actually looking at some of that below ground restoration at Nachusa Grasslands. This is a paper from a few years ago with some colleagues of mine. And here, the first thing we're looking at is root biomass. So here's all those plants that we're planting into those restorations. As those restorations mature, starting an ag field down here with essentially no root biomass, 5-year-old restoration, 10-year-old prairie, 15-year-old prairie, 20-year-old prairie, and you can see this real strong increase in roots. So these plants are growing, lots of roots going into the soil. That's feeding a lot of soil organisms. And here we contrasted a high plant diversity area and a low plant diversity area. And you can see that root biomass was much greater in that high diversity area. So then we looked at the soil kind of microbial community, and that's what this y-axis means. So the bigger the number, it means the more microbial biomass or the more microbes are in that soil. So that's kind of how you can think about this. And again, we see this trend increasing over time in these high plant diversity restorations at Nachusa Grasslands. And we didn't see that same trend in some of these lower plant diversity restorations. I more recently did a little bit of more research where I actually looked at the taxa, or what we would call species. So looking at bacteria in the soil, and bacteria are a little bit funky, that we don't really call them species the same way. But this map here, this graph here, the colors indicate soil communities from similar soils. So there's native prairies and restorations, and I chose two different types of soil. So you can see that soil type makes a really big difference. And dots that are closer to each other are more similar biodiversity than dots that are further apart. And what the real thing we see here is that our restored prairies in the purple and the pink, regardless of soil type, are more similar than the native prairies in the green and the brown. And so this shows us that restoration is actually leading to a different kind of bacterial community compared to our native prairies that have never been plowed up or converted. And we looked at fungi and we saw the same pattern, really similar in the restoration compared to these native prairie habitats. Now, why do we care about bacterial fungal biodiversity? There's, thousands of these taxa. What difference does it really make? We looked at this activity. So this is where we think about the consequences of all of this biodiversity. So this is particularly looking at carbon cycling. So this gets into some of that climate mitigation, decomposition, and we looked at nutrient cycling or nitrogen cycling. And what we found is that even though these communities look really different diversity-wise, they actually had very similar what we call function. They were performing these tasks in a similar way for carbon cycling, but not necessarily for nitrogen cycling. So the big take home here is that we can see really big differences in biodiversity, and that is intrinsically interesting. And sometimes that can have consequences for how the whole system functions, and other times it doesn't. There's a lot of replication, and in fact, that's part of why we really want to see biodiversity in soil, is so that these functions can continue even as things like climate changes or land use changes around it. So I know I've just been through a lot of really heavy science here, so I want to take a brief moment for questions once again.
So our first question is from Arun, and it is, how do having bison and other grazers impact soil or plant biodiversity?
Yeah, really great question. And I have done a lot of research on this in recent years. So I'm going to first talk about plant diversity, because I actually just published a scientific paper about that a year ago. So far at Nachusa grasslands here in Illinois, we have not seen an impact of the bison on the plant community. That the bison have only, well, I guess the information, the data that I synthesized in that work was only the first 5 years that the bison were on the site here at Nachusa. So it's possible that in 10, 15, 20 years, we will see differences. But so far, the plant community seems to be holding up about the same. However, we're finding that the animal community is very much responding to the bison presence. And this includes things like burrowing beetles and dung beetles that certainly have important interactions with the soil and parts of their life cycle that are underground. We know that the bison have really increased dung beetles, probably because they poop a lot. There's a lot more poop on the landscape. We also know that small mammals and their behaviors have changed with the bison grazing. It's changed how they look for food, in part because the grazing opens up that kind of grass canopy, and sometimes those mice can be more visible to predators, so it changes how they're behaving. And of course, these mice dig burrows in the soil and spend some time there. So far, from a soil microbial perspective, these bacteria and fungi, we're not seeing much of a bison grazing impact. So again, we're interested to see if that pops up in a few years, but so far, the microbial communities have been pretty, I guess, resistant to that bison grazing impact.
Okay, our next question is from Vinay. Are people in Illinois able to visit Nachusa and see the bison?
Yeah, really good question. We are open to the public. Anyone is welcome to come dawn to dusk any day. I'll have the website will be on my last slide, but you can Google Nichisa Grasslands. You'll find us all the information you need to get here. Um, we have hiking available throughout the preserve with the exception of inside the bison unit, but we have a great visitor center with an overview of the unit, and there's some parts of the bison unit along roadways. So sometimes you can see the bison up close. Other times they're in a little different part of the preserve and they can be hard to see. So there's no guarantee you'll see them. But yes, we have a great visitor center and hiking. We're open to the public. Anyone is welcome. And it's all free. There's no charge. So yeah.
So our next question is from Toby Kellner, and it is for young people interested in getting involved with ecosystem restoration. What are good areas of study or training to look into?
Yeah, really great question. So, um, ecosystem restoration is a really cool career path, if I do say so myself. And there's a lot of different ways you can get involved with it. So, if you're as a high school student who's looking to explore some of these options, one opportunity is we host some volunteer work days, and a lot of other organizations in your community might host volunteer work days as well. That can be a great way to come out for a couple of hours on a Saturday and just see, do you like doing this work? Picking seeds, controlling invasive species. You'll get a chance to see, oh, what is this about? Do I like this? You'll get a chance to interact with people who are doing that work. The other thing I recommend is as you're thinking about college or what might come after high school, think about pursuing that. There are opportunities for entry-level jobs right out of high school. We hire a seasonal crew in the summertime, and the requirements are a high school diploma and a driver's license. So that's kind of your starting point. So there is a pathway there. You can also go to college and get a degree in environmental science or biology or ecology or something along that line. And that's another great way to start building that skill set to do that kind of work. I went to college and then I went on to what's called graduate school. So I earned a few more degrees after my college degree because I really loved the research and asking questions. But that's not the only way to get there. There's a lot of great pathways into restoration work that don't require a lot of extra education too.
All right, from Genoa Kingston High School, they asked, with grasslands being restored, doesn't the bison grazing destroy some of the species?
Yeah, good question. So actually, the bison have been shown to help a lot of the native species we're trying to protect and restore. Bison were part of the tallgrass prairie ecosystem in Illinois. The grasslands co-evolved with grazing from bison historically for about 8,000 years. And so they are part of the system. And in fact, the reason the decision was made to bring the bison to Nichisa is because in other parts of the US where bison have been reintroduced, they've been found to increase plant biodiversity because bison will selectively graze on some of these tall grasses that can outcompete the flowering plants that are an important part of the prairie. So that was the kind of evidence-based reason for bringing these animals back. And like I said, we haven't seen that trend yet at Nichisa Grasslands, but we haven't seen any losses of species or negative impacts to plant biodiversity by reintroducing the bison.
So from the Illinois Master Naturalist from KKD Counties, they have asked how many bison are now living at Nichusa and do they live there year round? Are they supported by staff in the winter with hay or shelter, or do they forage survive on their own?
Yeah, really good question. So our herd, we have about 100 adults that overwinter in the herd. In the spring and summer, we get calves as well. Um, they are fully self-sufficient. We don't do any supplemental feeding. Again, the bison evolved in these systems. They can handle the cold winter. They don't need any extra shelter. They can eat the dead grass and live off of their fat reserves in the winter. They're really happy if we just leave them alone. So yeah, we don't do anything other than make sure they have access to great habitat and running water.
Alrighty, and then our last question asks, which invasive species of plants are most common there?
Oh, really good question. I love these questions. So we really struggle with invasion from a plant called bird's foot trefoil, which is a little slow-growing legume. It has yellow flowers. We have a lot of that on the preserve, and we spend a lot of time in the summer trying to manage against that. We also have some non-native bush clover species that they're not they're not super abundant on the preserve, but we work really hard to keep them as minimal as possible. We also spend a lot of time thinking about honeysuckle. That's a bush that is not native to this region. It has really invaded, and particularly in kind of the more woody or savanna areas, we have a ton of that. And that's actually in the winter. My colleagues are spending a lot of time trying to knock back against honeysuckle, cutting it, using some judicious herbicide to help control that. So those are kind of our big plant invasion concerns that we spend a lot of time with here at Nichusa. So great. Well, these are wonderful questions. And again, I'm going to kind of walk through this last portion of my talk, but please keep popping in questions as you have them, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for more questions at the end. So to kind of bring us home, I know this is a cliche, but I think it kind of wraps up the work I do and how I think about my work, and that is act locally and think globally. My work is really based at Nichusa Grasslands. I'm working at the preserve. I'm thinking about how we can manage these 4,000 acres to protect biodiversity both below ground and above ground in Illinois. But I also think about these actions and consequences beyond Nichusa, beyond Illinois, and even beyond the Midwest. And so the research I do helps my colleagues in other grasslands around the world think about restoration, both above ground and below ground, and those links between them and how important that is. And one way that I do that is contributing to reports like this, which one level they might sound kind of boring, but they're really important. This is a state of knowledge on soil biodiversity that was done globally. It came out a couple of years ago. This was done by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO. And this report was directly contributed to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'm not sure if folks have heard of that or not, but this is the big international group with all these member nations from around the world that come together every few years, and they think about biodiversity on Earth and how it is currently declining, and how can humanity as a global community show up to protect our fellow partners here on Earth. And this was the first report ever done synthesizing below ground biodiversity, soil biodiversity. I was a lead chapter author on this product, and because of this report, soil biodiversity was actually included last year in December 2022 at the big Convention on Biological Diversity's new agenda for biodiversity moving into 2030. So this was the big meeting that happened in Montreal, Canada. It was called the Calling Montreal Agreement. In part, it had been scheduled to be in Calling, China in 2020, and the pandemic threw that for a loop. So these are big global policy things. Essentially what this is the Climate Change Convention. You may have heard of that. They had a big meeting in Dubai a couple of months ago. This is the biodiversity side of the same kind of approach. So I wanted to share out about that the work that's happening here in Illinois and that my colleagues are doing all around the world in your backyards, wherever you're joining us from, it's all coming together and making a difference at the big scale as well. So we need that whole scaling. And finally, I wanted to share a few resources. For those of you who may want to learn more about all of the organisms that live below ground, this over 50% of life on Earth, this is a product that came out a few years ago, but it's still super relevant, the Global Soil Biodiversity Atlas. And actually, it's a big, I'm going to pull one off the shelf here. You can order it as a big book. I realize this may not work, so it's green. Sorry, apparently that doesn't work on, on Zoom. It's a big book. You can order it from the EU bookshop at cost. It's just shipping costs. The resource itself is free, or you can access it online for free. And it's full of wonderful pictures and information. This is a great resource for a classroom or a library, or just to dig in and learn more about soil. And again, the point is the content, we're trying to get it to you for free or as low a cost as possible. So with that, I am going to quit talking and listen for more questions from you all.
So we do have a question from Facebook, and it is, what do you like studying more, structure and function or cause and effect?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have to kind of wrap my brain around on what that means. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. A big part of my work is observing things and seeing how they work. But I like putting that in the context of restoration, where that might fall into more of that cause and effect, where we're doing an action on the landscape, and I am intentionally monitoring to see what the response to that action would be. If we plant these plants, how does it grow? If we, add grazers, how does that change the system? So that's probably more in the cause and effect area than just the pure structure and function, where there's less of that application. I hope that answers that question.
Alrighty, Brianna asks, have you studied soils anywhere else around the world? How do they compare?
Yeah, really good question. So I have done a little bigger. Most of my research has been in the Midwest, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, those places. But I have also done some research in Kansas, in New Mexico. I've collaborated on some of this global research where I have colleagues that know their soils at home really well, and we bring our knowledge together. The soils of the Midwest are some of the most rich in terms of organic matter in the entire world. To be honest, the soils of Ukraine are kind of the most similar to the soils of the North American Midwest in the entire world. Lots of other soils in the world will be sandier or it's drier, and they're not, the Illinois soils tend to be dark black, deep soils, but there's lots of places that have very shallow reddish soils or orangish soils, or you get into wetland areas where it's kind of a lot of that decomposing peat or moss, and you get a very spongy, springy type soil. You get desert soils that have very little moisture, so they tend to have very little organic matter, but they have these really cool bacterial, cyanobacterial communities that do a lot of that nutrient functioning, just like our soils do. You get soils in the tropical rainforests that are actually, they're very, very, very old soils. They're millions of years old. They don't retain a lot of nutrients themselves, but that nutrient cycling happens amongst the plants really well. So if a tree dies in a tropical rainforest, it decomposes really fast. So in Illinois, you might see a tree take years or decades to decompose. Sometimes that happens in weeks or months in the tropics, and those nutrients are just almost instantly absorbed by other living things. So yeah, so that's some of the diversity of soils around the world. I always love hearing from colleagues about the soils in their backyards.
So we just have a comment from Facebook from the Illinois entomology page, and that they had commented that you are so wonderful and their favorite scientist, and they just wanted you to know.
Thank you, Illinois entomology. That is incredibly kind. I'm honored.
And then we have a question from Arun, and it is, do you have a favorite type of soil?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. So I'm going to go with mollisol, which is the dominant common soil here in Illinois, or I'm actually from Iowa, so it's also the common soil in Iowa. So hands down, I love those deep black, deep dark soils that we have here in the Midwest. They always make me think of home.
I was wondering, have you ever run into any issues with certain soils?
What do you mean by issues?
Like, for example, like if you're like trying to figure out what soil it is, like have you had issues trying
Oh,
to decide or
I see. I see what you're saying. Yeah. That is a great question. And I'm going to have to admit, so there's a special kind of scientist who like defines soils. That world is called pedology. And I am not a pedologist. I am truly an ecologist and a biologist. And so I think a lot about what's living in those soils, but I am less well versed in terms of like what's truly called soil taxonomy. So this is going to be what I'm going to say. I don't know. I don't have a lot of experience in that area. But yeah, I'd encourage reaching out and maybe learning more about that world and the people who do that kind of work. Yeah.
So our next question is from Maria, and it is, how does soil diversity impact the fruits and veggies that we consume?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's a couple of ways you can think about that. One is a lot of the organisms that live in the soil. There's ones that can really benefit the trees and plants that produce fruits and veggies. Organisms that are breaking down organic matter, releasing those nutrients, helping those plants grow and be super productive. But there's also organisms that live in soil that can be pests or cause diseases. In fact, the cicadas that are emerging when they're underground can munch on fruit tree roots, and sometimes that can be a negative thing. Um, but then they're also a super positive thing when they turn over nutrients that really help those trees. We also can see like some fungal diseases or rusts. Sometimes those are called. I thinking of like the apple leaf rust. That's a fungal pathogen that can be a big problem for apple orchards. That lives in the soil, but also has some above ground parts of its life cycle. So the way the big take home I say is you want a lot of biodiversity because the more um, organisms in the soil and living happily in the soil, the more likely you are to have an organism that actually helps tamp down those pests and pathogens. And that can help us reduce how many chemicals that people will use to also tamp down those pests and pathogens. So it's thinking about that system and recognizing that there's benefits and costs in that system, and how can we work with the system so that those beneficial organisms actually help manage those detrimental organisms. I hope that wasn't too in the weeds.
Alrighty, your next question is from Facebook, and they asked, can you recommend a book we could read to learn more about soils and ecology?
Oh, really good question. A book. Oh, well, oh, the Atlas, honestly, is where I would start. That's a really good book, and there's a lot of pictures, so it flows through that pretty well. Um, there are a few books out there. Now I'm struggling. I'm kind of on the spot on like which one would I highly recommend. There's certainly some books out there. David Montgomery has a book called Dirt that gets into a lot of soil stuff. It's a little bit more geology oriented than biology oriented, but that one has been kind of in the popular press. It was published probably, oh gosh, it's probably been 10 years now, but that might be an interesting one to check out. But I would honestly start with Atlas. It's got a lot of photos and pretty accessible text. So.
So this question is from Mr. Devine, and it is, do you collaborate with Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie near Joliet? And how do state projects differ from Nature Conservancy projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie is a big grassland restoration project. It is managed and owned by the U.S. Forest Service, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So it's a federal project. And so federal projects sometimes differ from state projects. The Nature Conservancy is a private nonprofit organization, non-governmental organization. So some of the key differences, we do interact with our colleagues at Midewin. Some of them come up during when we pull the bison in once a year to do some vet checks and just make sure everybody's healthy. They came up this year and worked with us, and so there is some communication and collaboration there. But the management is two different agencies, and so um, on the one hand, I think the Nature Conservancy, we're a little more nimble in making this choices and being able to try things out and see how they work and change course if we need to. And so that's part of the bringing bison in and the data observation and the evidence and thinking about how we manage and interact with the animals. We were able to work with that in some ways. The federal system tends to have a little bit more rigid of rules and procedures, and that can provide some great benefit because it's more consistent across all those areas. So there's just some different approaches to how we do our work, but we do at least communicate and consider each other colleagues as we think about this work.
Okay, so our next question is from Kirby Martinez from Elgin High School, and he asks, how did you pick soil and ecology?
Oh, good question. So I feel like there's two ways to answer that. The first is, like many kids, as a small kid, I loved digging holes in the backyard, finding earthworms, bringing jars of like leaves home and be like, Mom, look at this. So part of me just feels like I never let go of that inner 5-year-old, and I still dig holes and look for earthworms all the time. And I can't believe I got away with like being paid to do that. Uh, on the other hand, I didn't come to it as a direct line from my 5-year-old self. Going through high school, got really interested in science. I was really excited about chemistry, and I think I'd read a book about Marie Curie, and I was just like, yes, I want to do that. And I went to college. I did decide to go to college, and I started out looking at chemistry as my major. And I found I loved the content, but I wasn't very excited about the benchtop stuff we were doing. It just didn't feel very applied or making a big difference in the big world. So I'd been taking some intro environmental science and biology courses on the side, and I kind of stumbled into this world of soils and plants. And what I found was that it was all the chemistry that I was like intellectually really excited about, but it was literally what converts dead things into the building blocks for living things. Is what continues that cycle of life generation to generation. And once I found that, I just kept asking questions and wanting to learn more. And that just kept kind of bumping into opportunities to continue doing that. And I loved doing that in my context, my home Midwest context. That's kind of why I've always been in prairies. Is just that's the system I'm at home in. But yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
Our next question is from Philip Salvador. Is there anything we can do at home to protect soils?
Yeah, great question. So one of the big things I like to recommend is in the fall, don't rake your leaves. It's okay. Just leave them on the ground. They'll be fine. There's tons of soil organisms and insects that are eating and living on those dead leaves all winter. They're really important, and it'll save yourself some effort. So yeah, I think that's a great one of just leave your leaves in place, and come springtime, if you mow your lawn, you'll chop them up in the first time or two, and those insects will have emerged into flying adults, and your grass will get a little natural boost from the leaf decomposition. So I think that's one of the easiest things you can do at home.
Okay, so our next question is from Gerardo Espinoza, and it is, if we are interested in studying ecology, what should we look for in a college?
Yeah, great question. So I would look at there are programs in environmental science or biology. Ecology is usually nested within biology. And depending on the college or the university, there may be different ways. There may be a specific department for more ecology focused work. Biology also includes a lot of that cellular, molecular, or pre-med kind of stuff, and the ecologists tend to be on the other end of that that spectrum of biology. So ask about ecology specifically, ask about environmental sciences, look for those kinds of courses. A lot of environmental studies programs will intentionally be interdisciplinary. They'll pull classes from a lot of different areas. So you'll get some biology, you'll get some chemistry, but you might also be taking some English classes with nature writers or some government or policy classes, political science classes around environmental policy and how that works, or you might be taking an economics class. That can be a really great way to go because you can start to see how ecology and nature can show up in a lot of different career paths. It's not always just a biology ecology. But yeah, that's hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, look at biology, look at environmental studies, and ask those questions about ecology or studying organisms. There's also some schools will have a natural resources department. That would be another area to look into.
All right, our next question is from Braulio Ponce. Some people consider plants, especially, and soil to be boring topics. What do you tell people that makes both topics exciting and interesting?
Yeah. Well, I often say that plants will get you excited about soils. Both of these topics, I know some people don't think they're very exciting. I think they're fascinating. And part of it is because they're kind of that foundation that just makes life on Earth work. Without plants, without soil, you just don't get rhinoceroses and sharks, to be absolutely honest. And so, to me, the fact that it's so foundational, it's so important to everything, that just, to me, is endlessly fascinating. And with 50% of global organisms living in the soil, there is no end of cool things to discover and learn more about. So it's you're always learning something new. I always say I'm not doing my job right if I don't learn something new every day.
Okay, so our next question is from Genoa Kingston High School, and it is, if using herbicides to decrease invasion of non-native species, does it harm or disrupt other native plants?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's something that we certainly think about a lot. There certainly can be negative impacts, and so we have to be really thoughtful about how we use these tools and how we apply them. And so in our work at Nachusa Grasslands, we're incredibly careful when we use herbicides to basically be on foot to target specifically the individual plant that we're concerned about, the specific bird's foot trefoil, the specific honeysuckle bush. And we do that so that we're minimizing any of that negative impact on these plants we've worked so hard to restore and replant into the system. And we've found that in terms of, we have 4,000 acres to manage. We can't go hand pull out of 4,000 acres. So it is a tool that allows us to manage at the scale we need to manage. And when we are thinking appropriately about it, we also often will use a much lower concentration than the manufacturer recommends. So sometimes we use a half or a third of the recommended concentration, and it's good enough to kill the plant that we care about, and it really minimizes that potential collateral damage. I will also briefly say I have done some soil biology research, and so far we've found no evidence that what the practices that we're using in Nachusa Grasslands, they've had no negative impacts on the soil communities, and happy to talk about that with somebody offline if they wish.
All right, the last question we have is from Toby Kellner. Where do you stand on the role of meat? Yes, because grazers can improve soils compared to plowing, or no, because of methane emissions and all the other environmental problems associated with our animal farming.
Yeah. And so my answer to this question is that for me, it is not a strong yes, no, these are often pitted against a dichotomy. The truth is, all of this is true. Grazing systems can be a great way to support native grasslands, particularly as you get further west into drier climates where they haven't used a lot of row crop traditionally, or you might need to irrigate, use a lot of groundwater to grow those row crops. So grazing on grasslands or grass-fed beef can be a really positive thing in some situations. The methane and greenhouse gas emissions certainly continues to be a concern. And so what I land is in moderation. So I do eat meat, but I eat it certainly less frequently than I grew up eating it, or and I think about that. So I try to buy a local grass-fed beef when I have that opportunity, and I don't eat it every day. I don't even eat it every week. So it's about finding that balance, realizing that I personally probably can eat a little less meat and think about the impacts on the systems overall, and other people who also many people in our world need protein, and how can I help make that more equitable around the world.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth Bach, for your lovely presentation and taking the time to share your passion with us. We appreciate all that you do. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, of course. And then next up is Neil Balkin talking about snake venom.
Thank you.
Thank you.